Ladies and gentlemen, it's a terrific pleasure for me to moderate this panel, not only because we have such a talented panel, who I'll introduce you to in a moment, and as well as a very active and contributing group, I'm sure. I can tell from the conversations going on already on the side, but because this topic is such an important topic. But let me take up the proposition. Is water the new oil? Some of you would have seen a Washington Post piece a couple of days ago, picking up on Reuters reporting from Istanbul, where there was a World Water Forum, which made this argument that water is in fact the new oil, that we're going to see increasingly the kinds of geopolitical scrambles, water wars emerging. We even saw the latest James Bond movie put forward this thesis. Some of you will notice the scramble for water leading to all kinds of international intrigue. So is that really what we're looking at? Is that a helpful way to think about the challenges that we face with the global freshwater crisis, as it's been termed? To help us think through this and to build on that, to think about what might be some of the solutions going forward. I have a panel who I'll introduce very briefly. Their bios, of course, are in your packets. From my far left, David Harrison, Nature Conservancy. Next to him, Peter Murdoch of the U.S. Geological Service. Michael Totten, Conservation International. And Ken Caldera, who is a climate scientist at the Carnegie Institution at Stanford. Rather than have set-piece presentations from our panelists, I thought it might be more interesting to jump right into some questions, so I'm going to do that. But I'm also going to ask all of you. I want this to be a very interactive session. I'd love to hear from you, particularly if you have ideas you want to contribute, questions for our panelists. Just make your presence known, and as it allows in the flow of the discussion, I'm going to turn to you, and we'll get a microphone to you to contribute your question for the panel. So please help me make this a much more interactive session than just us gassing on endlessly, as I've done thus far. So let me start with you, David. Water is the new oil. This is journalistically, I love it, of course, not just because I covered oil for many years at The Economist, but it's sexy. It's got all the elements of human drama, tragedy, crisis. It gets attention to an important question. Is this the right way to think about this? Is water the new oil?
It sure makes me uncomfortable. I think it's exactly the wrong way to think about it. Water is a commodity, it says. Well, water is not a commodity. Water is a natural resource. It's distributed on the land in some very important ways. And to think of it like oil in the ground, you can just mine it out and sell it in a market. You can stick it in a tanker and move it from one side of the globe to the other. Wrong-headed. What we need to ask about water is, can we come up with integrated ways of thinking about water that provide for the full range of services that we expect to get out of it? Now, yes, there is water scarcity in a lot of places. Yes, there will be more water scarcity. Yes, there will be problems with allocating water at times of shortage. Climate change is going to aggravate that problem, make everything more uncertain. There will be a role for water markets. There already is. We have a water market to try to restore environmental flows in the Murray-Darling in Australia. We've done it in Colorado. So there's a role for markets, but you get off on a bad start by saying water is a commodity. It is a natural resource carefully patterned in time and in space to provide a range of ecological functions, which in turn provide a bunch of ecosystem services. We have to start with that and then look at what trading may or may not be available.
Anyone on my panel speak out on the opposite? Does anyone think that, in fact, it might be helpful to think about the oil analogy?
Maybe anybody out there.
Or anyone in this room, in fact.
Are we done?
Well, exactly.
Well, I would say it's interesting because when I didn't see it as the next oil, I saw it as the linkages between energy and water, and what kind of energy decisions do we need to make, recognizing that water is such a serious problem. I grew up in Southern California, which stole water from Northern California, and back in the droughts in the 70s, it was clear that we were making bad decisions in the way that we were developing systems that were so energy and water dependent. And in fact, a very well-respected naturalist at that time, Roderick Nash, basically was so upset about hydro dams and the pace at which they were being built that he basically called for a shift to nuclear power, which I kind of disagreed with him because the nuclear power plant took out one of the best surfing spots right near where I grew up. And so each person, as that last workshop on energy suggested, has their favorite energy system. But I think in the case of this workshop, you can't ignore, as we go forward in climate, that Ken can certainly talk quite eloquently about, the implications of the amount of water that would be required and the risk and uncertainty of the assurity that that water will be there at the time needed. Has to be integrated and interdisciplinary in its approach.
A couple of ideas have come forward. You made the linkage with energy, and let's start with that. I know that, David, your initial response also talked about the role of markets, pricing, and the commodification, and I want to get back to that. But since we did start at least with a slightly tongue-in-cheek idea that we're going to link water and energy, I want to make sure to talk about that first. If it's not, let's say, the colorful analogy of oil, clearly there are linkages, powerful linkages between the worlds of energy and water. It takes enormous amounts of water, of course, to make ethanol or tar sands or shale. Some forms of energy production can be very water intensive, but others, perhaps like wind, are not. What should we think about as we go forward in the linkages between energy and water in a little more practical, maybe less sexy way? What's important? And to flip it around, of course, it takes energy perhaps to lift water out of the ground. So if perhaps you could talk a little bit about that, the linkages, Peter.
Sure. Well, I think you said it well. Clearly energy needs water. The energy business uses water in mineral extraction. They use water in creating fuels. At the same time, water, if we're going to be transporting it to places where people need it, inevitably is linked to oil in the current world. There's pumping, there's transport, there's treatment of water that requires energy. Desalinization is a concept that's being developed quite a bit around the world. So there's no question that they're linked. I come from this to this question in a slightly different way as a member of a scientific community that is charged with providing public service science for making policy decisions. So my question is whether it's a commodity or whether it's something that we are going to regulate, we're still going to need to measure it. And we're still going to need to understand all the different factors that enter into its availability, its quality, its whether or not it's going to stick around for a long time, whether or not we've got trends that we have to deal with. So I ask myself, how does calling it a commodity change the kind of information I have to provide to you, the decision makers, in order to make sound, scientifically based decisions? And so from my perspective, it doesn't really matter. I'm not sure it's an analogy that's useful.
How you organize water systems delivery and the incentives within, I guess, is a different question from the more fundamental one that you're pointing out. That is the state of information, knowledge about ecosystem services, about how we measure water, its usage, and the changing patterns, its impact through climate change. I think you've showed in your work around the world there is no standard measures. We often use apples and oranges kinds of measures that can't be compared.
And in fact, we have a big problem right now with that. In that if you look around the world at all the different engineering concepts that have been used to make water available to us and provide clean water to all of us, it's all based on this concept of stationarity. Stationarity means that the system is basically stable, that there's going to be variability. As we know, there's seasonal variability over the course of the year. There's a probability that we're going to have a certain number of big events over a 10-year period. 25 years ago, we didn't know what El Nino was. Now we know that there are these oscillations that occur on decadal time scales. And all of our engineering is based on the concept that those things fluctuate, but that basically over time, they stay relatively stable. And as a result, we've got a big problem now because stationarity is dead. Climate change changes the entire ballgame on stationarity. And so we need to figure out now how to make models that deal with trends and that deal with subtle trends.
In a sense, we're flying blind. The world is changing rapidly, and we need better measurement systems, at least to inform whatever kinds of
I think it'd
decisions
be
we
unfair
make.
to say we're flying blind at this point. There's a lot of serious science going on that's helping us out.
Speaking
But
of which,
we
let's-
have a lot of new science we need to do as well.
Let's turn to Ken, who is a serious scientist, and for his thoughts on that.
Not so serious. But anyway, I'd like to push back on this water is not a commodity point and reinforce this stationarity point. In California now, because of inefficient allocation of water, we have farmers growing water-intensive crops like cotton and rice. And especially in a situation where we expect the California snowpack to be disappearing and less water available during the growing season, that many economists have come to the view that the best thing you could do to California's water supply problem is to turn it into a commodity because the market is relatively efficient at allocating scarce resources, and the problem is that we're not treating water enough like a commodity.
Michael, can you respond to that? Because I know your organization actually thinks about the role of incentives in the context of a system-wide analysis.
I mean, I both agree and disagree with Ken, because on the one hand, water is used extraordinarily inefficiently. On the other hand, there is a need for minimum ecological flows for the integrity of the ecosystem and the watershed if you're going to talk about taking species survival seriously. I mean, it's the freshwater systems that have the highest level of extinction rates and threatened species, by far exceeding anything on terrestrial species or marine species. At the same time, as you point out with the glacier loss, that's at the recent World Conservation Congress in Barcelona, where there were 10,000 conservation scientists. They were just beside themselves. What's going to happen with this dramatic loss of glacier-fed water, which not only is going to afflict probably upwards of 1 billion people worldwide that rely on that water, but just also the additional threat it poses to species. I mean, before climate change, species were threatened, and that's why I think Ken's point, to a certain degree, you certainly want allocation of water efficiently. But you also need to think about.
But I mean, isn't just to take up the mantle here a bit that Ken has started to? If waste is such a problem, and perhaps not everyone in the room follows the water issue as closely as you folks. A couple of general stats. The lion's share of the world's fresh water is consumed by agriculture. Depending on the country, it can be the overwhelming amount. And much of that water, I think it's widely agreed, is wasted in agriculture, often through evaporation. And even for the small share that comes into people's homes, much of the water, up to half in some places, is lost in the piping and inefficient systems for delivery. Enormously grotesque distortion and waste of what is a precious resource. Whether you call it a human right or you consider it, we can't live without water, clearly. But to see the lion's share of it going into sectors that are not going to basic human needs and also being wasted surely argues for some mechanism. And one thing we know is that, particularly if you're going to do it for agriculture or industry, price mechanisms work in other sorts of industries. When something is given away free or practically free, people tend to undervalue it. So isn't there an argument, at least after assuring basic human needs, especially for the poorest, free if need be, or whatever other approach a society wants to do? In South Africa, the basic human needs, up to a certain number of liters, are given free for all as a basic human right. But uses for filling your giant swimming pool, for example, are charged at a different rate than the basic human needs for consumption. And industrial and agricultural uses are priced differently. Is there an argument for a hybrid system that tries to take advantage of the fact that market mechanisms can motivate less wasteful behavior?
I would say wholeheartedly, and in fact, the California, I think, regulatory system recognized this, and it's interesting that in the recent years they've gone to an integrated water and electricity and natural gas resource planning system, and they recognize that there's so much opportunity at the point of use and the local on-site or distributed areas that you can get such high efficiency improvements that you can dramatically reduce both the cost and the need for additional supplies so that you, from our perspective, keep enough water in the system while delivering the service of water. You know, as it was said decades ago, it's not so much energy per se that you want the service of energy, whether it's the heating, the cooling, the refrigeration, same thing with water. And it turns out that, like in California, 20% of all of the electricity and a third of all the natural gas goes just to extract, move, heat, and then distribute wastewater. And they found out that, like with electricity, it was 5 times cheaper to actually give an incentive to somebody to install or purchase a water-efficient shower head, faucet, drip, maybe move to a more local landscaping, xeric landscaping instead of a lawn, or to buy a clothes washer that used less water. Those things came in at 5 times less the cost of water expansions. And if you think about that globally, the utility system and the energy system worldwide, we're talking this century at a 2 to 3% growth, where typically utilities and energy take up about 8% of the cost of a global economy. We're going to go through some $1,500 trillion in revenues for our entire energy and water system. And if a lot of that is going to just be misallocated capital. We could do this, as McKinsey report showed, they mainly looked at energy efficiency, but the water efficiency has the same applications, is that half or more of the energy services that we need between now and 2030 could be met more cheaply and at lower risk through efficiency improvements at the point of use. And in fact, in the developing country, they estimate between 50 and 75% because of all the new construction, new factories, new appliances. And if you can design a regulatory system that moves from the legacy systems of the last century, which are fixated in an artifice sort of way on supply expansion, and expand it to include the opportunity to give incentives to customers to use it more efficiently, for manufacturers to design and build it more efficiently, we could free up an immense amount of capital while, I think, actually accelerating poverty reduction as well as preventing
You make a powerful point. Rather than, on the energy analogy, drill, baby, drill, ever looking for more supply, if you can also look for what Amory Lovins has long advocated, looking for negawatts.
Yeah.
In water, perhaps we should look for mega jugs, I guess, is the new mantra.
Peter Glick has been talking about for over 15 years, a MacArthur Genius Award recipient, but that, I think, makes a lot of sense.
You wanted to jump in, David, and I know you were initially skeptical about the commodification. What do you think about the ideas put forward by Michael and Canham on this way of thinking about water markets?
There is a role for market-based transactions, just the ones that were described. It's a wonderful role. It can do much more than we're talking about. It can be very effective in dealing with drought situations. For example, what do you do when you have a drought? Is a city supposed to have a bomb-proof water supply so when the drought comes that there's no curtailment? Or is it a matter that at that time you can have some creative transactions to soften the blow? But let me say what I think is wrong-headed about starting the discussion by calling it a commodity. And in fact, it's even wrong-headed to start the discussion by talking about efficiency or inefficiencies that we can address. What we need to start the conversation is an understanding of that whole system. Usually a basin or maybe a region. Maybe it gets integrated because of an electrical grid or something. There is a system in which these questions come up. And we have to understand that because the most important efficiency is how the parts fit together. So if I stick a dam in the middle of an ecosystem, it's going to be very inefficient from the standpoint of maintaining species. If I can find representative ecosystems that are easily protected and allow development of a dam in other places, that is efficient. Now, that's a funny kind of efficiency. It's very different from what you're talking about. It is better, perhaps, thought about as a best fit between the components that provide the set of services that we want. And if I may, let me now add, the real challenge, I think, the real linkage between energy climate and water is on the hydrology side. It's not so much what water use is going to do to aggravate or to assist in the carbon problem. It's what is the carbon problem going to do to water. We are going to face an increased range of uncertainties on what the water supply is. So the best guesses in a lot of places is we're going to have more floods and worse floods. We're going to have more drought and worse drought. So we have to think of systems that can respond to that. And maybe the placement of infrastructure, the way infrastructure is operated optimally between each other.
It's really the question of adaptation.
This gets to adaptation now because a really good system, we're not going to measure it so much in efficiency terms, we're going to measure it in terms of resiliency or robustness to respond to the wide range of risks and still provide the range of services we need, and first and foremost amongst those services, ecosystem services. If we blow that off, we put the bottom right out from under the whole
I can
game.
see the audience is bristling with questions. I'm going to already, there's a gentleman's hand here and one there next. I'll go, but I'm going to give Ken a chance because I know this is an area of some expertise. Please give us your views.
Well, this discussion has been largely U.S.-centric so far. I just want to lay out some of the patterns of change that are expected as a result of climate change. One is increased evaporation and decreased precipitation in the tropical latitudes and increased precipitation at the high latitudes. Now, since there's also warming, the crops in the low latitudes are already heat stressed, and so they're going to get more heat stressed and less water. At the same time, the growing season it will likely increase in the northern mid-latitudes along with the precipitation. And so the general picture is one of generally increased crop yields in the high mid-latitudes, or northern mid-latitudes, and decreased crop yields in the tropics. And there's also an income distribution difference there. And so the more wealthy people are tending to get improved crop yields while the poor are getting decreased crop yields. So I think there's a question of both equity here and how do we deal with this.
But am I right that lest people think that only the poor are getting screwed? The Sahara is on the march northward, getting ready to invade southern Europe, and at least the rich can't be complacent about this.
No, the desert bands are moving poleward, and so most dramatically, I think this is already being seen in southern Europe, where essentially the Sahara is starting to move into southern Europe. And then I think, to reinforce your point, another general pattern is dry places getting drier and wet places getting wetter. So there's the kind of almost paradoxical thing of increased drought and increased flooding.
This raises important questions about how do we respond to this changing world, adaptation. I would argue, what does it say about people living in the wrong places, thanks in part to subsidized flood insurance, as we have in the U.S. and other kinds of perverse distortions in other countries? Does it mean we need to rethink future patterns of development to encourage people out of harm's way? But let's get to that after we get in a couple of questions. I'm going to ask for 3 questions, and we'll ask the panel to chew on them in the interest of efficiency, since I see many hands. This gentleman here has been very patient. We'll start here. We'll cross over, and then in the absence of any ladies' hands, I'll go to that gentleman there who's eagerly waving near the camera. Third.
I'm John Hayward at MIT. I think David got us off to a very honest start. Then I'm sorry, the rest of the panel
went downhill,
changed direction and forgot about that honest start. Fortunately, he had some time to come back and restate it more carefully and more strongly. Well done. Because I want to say, and then ask you how we fit this in. We are taking water. We've got to think of taking water from our natural environment. You could even say we're stealing water. We may well want to manage it. Of course we want to manage what we take and use as efficiently as possible. But I think we've got to remember what we're fundamentally doing. And we've always got to keep going back to that as we try and use this essential resource. Where does it come from? And as we take more and more and more and more, what do we do to our local, regional, even global natural environment? So I hope as you continue, you can keep, in a sense, one foot connected to what I think David very perceptively started us on.
Very good. The gentleman there, if you can just wait a moment for the microphone, please. If you'd be kind enough to identify yourself as well, we're recording this.
I bring to this the experience of a regulator who had to manage the water resource in a severe drought in an affluent state, which is not a fun thing to do. I really want to defend the analogy to oil, though, because I think there's a comparison, not in terms of entitlement versus commodity, but really in terms of the failure to price the commodity in a way that reflects all of the externalities of its consumption is very closely comparable to oil. And it's that failure, I think, that really leads to both political and economic crisis and challenge, at least the distortions you mentioned in terms of where agriculture occurs, places where it probably shouldn't occur, and particularly for in terms of where we spend public money and what we pay for when we buy water, we pay too little. When the Nature Conservancy preserves tracts of watershed lands that preserve the resource, the people who are consuming that resource on the other end should be footing the bill. And yet the prices of water really don't affect the full range of costs of its consumption. And so in that sense, I think the analogy is apt, and I'd invite the panel to comment.
Very good. And the gentleman in the back, please. So we've had a question about taking water and local consequences, one about externalities and how to think about the proper pricing.
Bill Blakemore with ABC News. The description of this panel promised that the panel would also wrestle with what appears to be a very devilish additional problem, which is that the alternative energy, which global warming makes us want more and more of, seems to be very thirsty at a time when global warming also is going to make water more and more scarce. And it lists some of the ways. And I'd love to hear the panel wrestle with what appears to be other parts of this problem banging into each other and making each other even worse.
Okay. Well, why don't we take those in reverse order? Since you put a pointed challenge to the panel, let's talk about this. The linkage between energy and water comes up again, in particular about alternative energy. Now the gentleman posits alternative energies as water intensive. Is that universally true? Are there some good guys as well as bad guys? Someone want to take that question and help us distinguish what is the nature of the problem?
Well, I touched on this in my opening comments because, of course, we want services. We don't want energy per se, just like we want water services, not water per se. If you can get half your services or more going forward through efficiency, not only do you get dramatic reductions in water consumption as well as the array of emissions, whether they're urban or global greenhouse gases.
That's a bit of a duck, isn't it? Because you could say that, or that's ducking the question. That's a rising tide that lifts all boats, whether you're water intensive or not.
That's not true, because if you did not do the efficiency in the first point, you would have, for example, we have 300,000.
No, you'll get no argument from me, having written a book all about this, arguing the case for more energy efficiency.
But see, this is the problem.
I'm just saying, how do we address the gentleman's question?
All right. Let's just assume half of our solution is efficiency. Now, what do we do with the other half? I think that's a grand conception, and it needs more discussion. On the supply side, you basically only have two, I think, options, solar photovoltaics and wind, that use 2 orders of magnitude less water compared to thermal power plants, although the thermal power plant research is, just to give you a figure, in the U.S. and in Europe, 40% of water use is by thermal power stations. That's use, as opposed to the agriculture use side, which is consumption. So it's a once pass-through. Now, you can move to air-cooled systems. This has an energy penalty of a couple of percent, and obviously we'll continue to evolve that. But obviously, I would think going forward, if you're going to build any thermal power plant, not only should it be required not to release any carbon, but it shouldn't use any water, particularly in the western U.S. I mean, it's a different case than the eastern
It's right to say that biofuels, generally speaking, are water intensive.
It varies on where they're growing the crop, but certainly if you're talking about exotic crops that are specially grown for fast-growing species, I suspect it will have a lot of agrochemical and water inputs.
Even ones that grow on marginal land, jatropha and so on?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The more marginal the land, I would expect a greater water increase. The other thing, I would just caution that hydro dams or hydropower that require hydro dams are not a carbon free, climate-friendly solution. I was just working in Manaus in South America with S.C. Johnson. They're building their new South American corporate headquarters there. They get their electricity from the Balbina Dam, which has emissions 60 times greater than the fossil-fired power plant it displaced. So there's been, in fact, some 30 basins that have been analyzed for emissions, because when you get into tropical areas as opposed to mountainous areas where you've got a steep flow, in the tropics you're flooding vast areas, and the vegetation is releasing methane over the lifespan of those power plants. So they estimate that maybe as much as 7% of total global greenhouse gas emissions are due to emissions, not just from the tropics. You also have peatlands in the temperate and boreal areas that are also have flooded, releasing methane.
Let me stop you there. It's a pity our friend Achim Steiner couldn't make it because of the snowstorms. He formerly headed the World Commission on Dams, which many of you will know came out with a series of reports, one of which made very clear that dams are not carbon neutral, and particularly dams in tropical countries are different in their carbon footprint than those in temperate regions or in Scandinavia.
2 to 30%.
But David has been very patient, wanting to jump in on this. If you can also perhaps continue on with this response to answer
I want to go back to this question about alternative energy water supply requirements. And the proposition asserted was that they are somehow going to require more water than other kinds of energy. I don't think so. Now, biofuels will have a significant water footprint. It'll take water in a lot of cases to produce biofuels. But it already takes a lot of water to produce any kind of thermal energy transformation, cooling primarily. It takes a lot of water to grow food. So it doesn't necessarily take more water to grow a biofuel. It throws us right back into the discussion about fuel versus food. So I'm not sure you get anywhere by saying alternative fuels take more water. They do take water, and they do have to be fitted into the water budget of a basin. Again, I'm back to my basin, I'm back to my pattern. Where are the protected areas? Where are the ecosystem areas? Where are the development areas? Where are the agricultural areas? How much water is getting burned up for this whole set of uses, and what are the services produced? Now, it's not like you can say that water is a reason not to do biofuels. I do think you've got to look at biofuels as a land use problem, and water is a part of that analysis. Now, if I could say something else on the hydro side, and it's different from where you're going, Michael, I'm not as worried about reservoir emissions. Yeah, Balbinus is terrible. Some of the tropical reservoirs are terrible. What the hydropower industry has to do is stand up and take responsibility for a net carbon calculation. And some will be better and some will be worse. There's a more insidious problem related to hydropower. Hydropower is essentially non-consumptive except for the evaporation on the reservoir. In most systems, that's not a very large part of the water budget. But what it does is change the timing of flows. And I said at the outset that the key thing about water as a natural resource is it's patterned. It's patterned spatially, and it's patterned temporally. And those patterns are really key toward the ecological health of that system and the underpinning of all of the services that are going to come out of that system. So if we change the timing, we risk some serious damage. What alternative energies, in terms particularly of the renewables, is doing on that score is, as we know, to bring the renewables into the grid at scale. We have to deal with storage. We have to deal with stabilizing the source of energy when it's being produced to match it up with the demand. The guys in the hydropower industry are quick to say, we can do that. We can use our dams because we can easily turn up the rate of release of water or squeeze it back and make it match the wind. And I just get terrified thinking about what that will do to the aquatic ecosystem. I have nightmares about a river flow regime that looks like the inverse of the pattern of wind. Right. That is a serious risk on the ecosystem posed in a quite indirect way by renewable energy. But it doesn't have to be that way. There are storage solutions that will work, I think, immediately at pump storage, an old-fashioned idea. That takes the fluctuations off of the river. There are new storage ideas. Storage is a key problem that has to be resolved. If it gets resolved, I don't see the alternatives being a major problem in the water environment.
In fact, of course, energy storage is one of the essential enablers for transforming the economics of renewable energy, grid stability. It's one of the game changers, and I'm happy, of course, as everyone else is here, that there's so much advanced work in batteries and other areas going on that might help us get to a better solution. than the one using hydro. I want to turn to Ken, because I know you had a response both to John Haywood's important point as well as the externalities question.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce the perspective that you put forward, because I do think that the environmental preservation needs to be up front, and that we need to establish what we can take from the environment without damaging it too much. And then I think we need to price the externalities appropriately, putting in proper safeguards to address equity issues and let the markets distribute it. So I think there's a consistent vision, and we're not really at odds.
I think there's especially in light of the second question we had about externalities, it seems a pretty strong argument that if we were to do full life cycle analysis and proper assessments of externalities, including the questions of water consumption of energy, which is sometimes left out. You do certain kinds of externalities pricing. Carbon is very common, but less often do we think about the water footprint and the ecological impact on ecosystems. If we were to do a proper life cycle analysis when weighing up different options, that's the kind of thing that presumably integrated resource planning will help look at trade-offs.
And I hope people understand this important difference of the utility has a legacy of only comparing one supply option to the other. And California, since 1982, has just busted open wide the whole utility paradigm, saying utilities have historically, the more they sold, the more their revenues went up, the more they earned. And even if I had zero-cost energy efficiency in my home or factory, they had no interest whatsoever in helping me, because the revenues would go down, fewer sales, and their earnings would go down. And what California says, we're going to decouple your earnings from your revenues, and so we will recoup your lost earnings to the degree that you help your customers find the cost-effective efficiency that is less than expanding supply. Now, what is important about this, and California has convinced 3 provinces in China to begin to adopt this type of strategy, is that it now widens it to the point where you now have everything on the table, all the end-use efficiency, on-site solar, building integrated PV, combined heat and power, et cetera, and you factor in the externalities and the correct pricing. Then you have, I think, a situation where you're probably going to see an immense amount of these dams, nuclear power plants, and coal plants just not pass a cost test.
Let's take a few more questions from the floor. There's a gentleman here. Let's see, perhaps we'll go there for the second question, and a third one to be determined in a moment. Yeah.
Just shifting the argument for a moment.
Please introduce yourself, sir.
Carter Bales. As I understand it, the Philadelphia water distribution system loses between 12 and 14% of water in the century-old pipes, and many urban systems are losing close to 20%. So acknowledging the short-term bias in our economic system, if we're losing those amounts of water, how can we be not focusing on that issue as well?
Okay, so system losses. Let's have a question there.
Bob Goff, Intertribal Council on Utility Policy. My experience has been in the Missouri River Basin, looking at those dams and where there's substantial wind resources there, and the opportunities of finding a complementary way of using both resources, optimizing them. It's the Bureau of Reclamation, going back to the Reclamation Act, and the build-out of those dams operated by the federal government. Hydropower is the fifth and incidental benefit of those dams, and they're managed for navigation, they're managed for recreation, managed for irrigation, and managed for endangered species. And then it's, oh yeah, when water's going through the dam, why don't you generate some electricity? That's sort of the general model. The reality is they are now currently being used as cheap peaker plants for coal. And the base load is handled by coal. About 85% of that grid is now carbon. Used to be 100% was hydro, 85% is carbon, and the flick of the switch is what dispatches that hydropower as a peaker plant. So it's already being managed in a way that I think you're somewhat fearful.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. And I think that wind can take off some of the pressure because of the next issue, which was I was going to bring up for Michael. While utilities and generation of electricity, they don't just use water. There is consumption. There's a lot of evaporation. thousands of gallons a minute is happening, and that's why we're seeing the Missouri going down and more of that water hanging in the air long enough to fall. Oh, in Cedar Rapids. Oh, in Fargo. This is where that water is moving to.
Yeah.
So we're already seeing a consumption of conventional that far outweighs what the consumption patterns would be for the alternatives, renewables, wind in particular.
Yeah. Great. Actually, let's have one last question for this round. Gentleman on that kitty corner there.
My name is Brian Goldstein. I have a private company in alternative fuels. To continue the alternative energy discussion, we don't have to necessarily discuss the merits of a hydrogen economy, but I'd like to hear your opinion of the implications of a hydrogen economy on the water supply. And then I also wanted to bring up people in this country generally, especially consumers, take water for granted and just assume that, every day we can go turn the faucet on and it's going to be there. And I think Katrina was a real eye-opener that, hey, there are outlier events that could occur that will take this, this commodity away from us. So I'd like to ask you guys, what you think about the security implications of the water supply in this country, especially in population centers that may be much larger than New Orleans. Take the eastern seaboard or California. Whether it's a man-made threat, a terrorist threat, or an earthquake disrupting the water supply in Southern California.
Okay, very good. Let's start with the second question from Bob about the examples from your part of America. I think, Ken, you had a response you wanted to?
No, I didn't. I had a question.
You had a question? Well, let's hear the question.
Well, it's off topic from the previous question, so I can hold
Okay.
it.
Why not? You have the microphone.
Okay, well, I was going to ask a question. We're being very U.S.-centric here. And if we think of people living in the Sahel who are already close to the edge and with the potential of getting even drier, what sorts of actions should people living in the Sahel take, and people who are concerned about the Sahel, to increase their resilience to the water threats that they're facing?
Yeah. So we have a direct question. With apologies to our questioners from the floor, let's tackle it. It does tie into the question we had before about adaptation. What can we do?
No, I actually think it ties in with what we've been discussing beforehand, and also back to Bob's point.
Great.
Since one of our concerns is the Chinese hydro engineers are hell-bent on making this the golden era of hydro dam construction, and the last remaining...
and they do it with inspiration from the U.S., don't they, 100 years ago?
Yes,
the
indeed.
Hoover Dam. And
yes, right.
They think that was the glory days of the U.S.
Right. So they're running around the world financing large dams for mining, for energy, for large irrigation schemes. And so this raises the question, how do you, again, get the services, particularly impoverished people in these developing countries that are cash poor? If you start with, I kind of like to look at it as fractal finance as opposed to pyramid finance. Pyramid we know of recently with the big financial crisis. Fractal, I think of Grameen Bank, where you're offering $50 and $100 loans for the most impoverished people that have no collateral other than people getting together in a cluster and helping each other. And when you do something like that, there's a dear friend of mine at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, Ashok Gadgil, who's taken his prize winnings and invested in a company called Water Health International. And he developed the invention, which is a little ultraviolet lamp that purifies water at 4 cents per 1,000 liters, or a cubic meter, about 250 gallons of water. 4 cents. That's some 6 times less than the central treatment plants that deliver water, this kind of pyramid mentality. So I think a lot of it is just an expansion of that fractal finance worldwide.
Sorry, just to make the link, the idea is that rather than necessarily extending an expensive and efficient decentralized distribution model like the grid itself,
that's right,
that there may be decentralized solutions that might help solve some of these problems.
Exactly. And it follows on to energy, because once the very first thing they do when people of the most impoverished sort get money is they want energy, electricity, lighting. And that's another follow-on example of fractal finance, where for now, what 5 years ago would have been a compact lamp and a solar photovoltaic with a battery that cost $500, now you can do it with a 1-watt LED with a much smaller PV system, and you can do it for a loan under $100, $50 to $100. What's interesting of the examples is that a little itinerant shop of an impoverished person took out a loan, got the PV, bought the, along with 6 LED lights, and then gave 5 to the other impoverished shops that were around it. And then they paid him back $2.50 a month, and he paid off the loan over a period of months. And you suddenly had a little micro utility of light and an oasis of light in a sea of darkness. And I think what we want to do is to look at this, to scale it up in an aggregate way of these many little fractal loans. Now, that's not to say you aren't going to have large-scale things like wind power. If you think of the Great Plains here, on the Great Plains where 95% of the terrestrial wind power is located, you would, according to the Western Resources Associates, if you were to provide 40% of America's electricity through wind, about 400,000 megawatts, it would save 1 trillion gallons of water a year, an immense amount of water. At the same time, just to, let me follow through this and then I'll stop, is the implications. Right now, 75% of the Great Plains is farmed or ranched. As David pointed out, there's already existing uses, yet it generates less than 5% of total revenues in the Great Plains. So you've got 75% of the Great Plains farmed or ranched, less than 5% of the total revenues. Meanwhile, because of the royalty streams that are paid to farmers and ranchers for wind farms, you would see, on average, twice as much income go to those ranchers and farmers on just 2 to 3% of the land area of the Great Plains. Now, I think from an eco-restoration perspective, one of the implications is if you create that type of sustainable financial income for rural strapped communities, and it's not just domestic, I think you can look at China and some parts and other parts of the world, the same argument holds, is that they could move out of exhaustive types of farming and ranching, move back to deep-rooted native prairie grasses, particularly because this region is moving into a mega drought that is going to persist for decades and decades, so that you have at least a little bit more resilience for the ecosystem, and you then have a third, and that's a carbon stream that they could offer in a voluntary market to sell back. We lost over 1 billion tons of carbon in the Great Plains when we ranched and farmed. And then the third thing is bison co-evolved with those prairie grasses, and we've actually, in our organization, and working with Walmart to move them into a sustainable supply chain, they've actually thought, well, now that they're one of the world's largest organic seller of produce, bison free-range beef might be just an interesting thing combined with wind and eco-restoration. So I actually think we need to be thinking in a systems bigger way than all the compartmentalized thinking that's been going on for the last 25 years that I've been involved in this issue, because otherwise you end up with an engineered solution here that results in ignoring a water basin here or an impoverished group over here. It's just absolutely ridiculous.
Well, Walmart saves the American West. You heard it here first, folks. Now, we had a couple more questions. Yes, if you can, particularly if you can jump in on some of the questions about system losses or the security questions about the water.
Well, I mean, all of these point to increased efficiencies, and the exciting news, that, like we just heard, is that there are newer and newer ideas that are coming out that are making us more efficient. The good news in the data, actually, is that efficiency over the last 30 years has made a huge difference already in places where they can afford it. The population, if you look at the trends in water use versus the trends in population, the trend in water use has been relatively flat while the population has been going up in the United States.
And there used to be a historical linkage, I believe, between increase in GDP per head, and water consumption, that the U.S. has managed to break that link.
We have managed to break that link. And technologies like these, as you get closer and closer to where an individual is taking control of some of this, you could probably see more efficiencies. I get back to that original question about alternative energies. I think it's important to stress that the problem is spatially specific. That there are going to be places, yes, where we're going to have a water scarcity. There's also going to be places where we're going to have too much water. There's changes. And this has been true throughout the history of the planet, that water shifts around the country, around the world, so there will be parts of the United States maybe where the multiple uses that we are trying to apply will tip us over some sort of threshold.
I mean, this is
some
the
sort of
fundamental
tipping point, and so the key is to really understand the system sufficiently to know where those tipping points and thresholds are, to understand how much can we use before we start really stressing the ecosystem in this landscape? And that, if you take a watershed approach to water management, then you are going to inevitably then get into the business of trying to figure out what the capacity of that watershed is.
Now, the oil analogy comes to mind again because, of course, unlike oil, which is a non-renewable resource, unless you want to wait millions of years for more crunched-up dinosaurs' bones to emerge, water is a renewable resource, fresh water. It's just in the wrong place, in the wrong quantities, and not where we've built ourselves up.
It doesn't think so, but I suppose
Right. Well, a lot of it's in Canada, which doesn't use most of it and won't share it with anyone else. But what if there were a game changer? This is a question from my panel. I'm going to just ask a quick yay or nay vote. I'll put you guys on the spot. Some people are quite excited about the prospects of desalinization. Whether it's at the centralized plants that we already have in the Middle East or much more smaller, nimbler, decentralized units that might be available for the ordinary person around the world. If you take a 20-year view, how many of you think that this might actually be a significant contributor to fresh water usage around the world? And how many of you think this is a non-starter, dead-end, red herring? I mean, so just without a long pontification, just a quick 20 years. Yes? First I'll ask my panel, then I'll turn to the audience. How many of you think in 20 years this will be a real solution that will bring more fresh water?
Significant, VJ, not necessarily large scale.
Not the whole solution.
Very strategic, very important.
Anyone else agree that in 20 years the technology will be ready?
Urban areas for polluted water, like in China with combined heat and power.
You think desalinization will play a role?
In a combined heat and power mode.
Anybody want to say no, that you really think this technology ain't going to go?
Whether that technology will be ready.
I think it depends a lot on how good we are at developing relatively cost-affordable, low-carbon energy technology.
What do you think? What's your judgment?
I think
It's
we
an
already
energy
have
consumer.
I'll give you an example. The Escalon plant in Israel is delivering combined heat and power reverse osmosis desalinated water for 50 cents a cubic meter. In Beijing right now, they pay 75 cents a cubic meter. Yet they want to bring water from the south up to Beijing. Now, what Beijing is also doing is it's putting polluted water right into the river. So you have a contaminated river problem, and now you're spending more money to bring it up from the south. So in that type of situation, it's, to my mind, a no-brainer that you would want to use combined heat and power, which also gets you some steam or electricity for the building, while also providing the electricity for the reverse osmosis process.
Now, you mentioned Israel. Israel, of course, is a world leader in drip irrigation and very, very resource-sparing approaches to agriculture. If only the world's entire agricultural system used technology from 1990 that Israel has had since then, we would actually go a long way towards tackling the world's water problem, would we not?
Phenomenal. And in fact, we
this is
haven't
more
even...
about, classic story about innovation. This is really about the diffusion of existing technology. It's not about inventing new rocket science.
VJ, I got a problem with efficiency again. We define efficiency in this across-the-board way like it's always good to have efficiency. Carter Bales raised a very interesting problem about an infrastructure inefficiency that was costing money, but it wasn't burning up more water. And we don't know enough from what he said about the Philadelphia situation, whether it's displacing water from ecosystems. And drip irrigation is actually not more efficient. In terms of the evapotranspiration per unit of crop. What it's efficient at is getting more evaporation out of a given delivery system.
Reducing your
less
evaporation.
return flow.
But evaporation is a huge problem in many water systems.
But the amount of evaporation from a square meter of alfalfa is not different if you supply it with old western Colorado flood irrigation or if you supply it with Israeli drip irrigation. It's exactly the same consumption. What's different is the amount of water you pour on it and the amount of water that seeps back to the stream. Now, water seeping back to the stream can be a problem. It could pick up salinity, it can have water quality issues. But notice we shifted what is the nature of the problem. I want to go back to basics. In our watershed, what is the set of services that we want to get produced? And what is the best fit way to do it? And so, and if I could, please, I love this comment on externalities and the analogy to oil. I agree with the premise that we need to price water systems so that they cover all of the externalities. That's a little different than saying we price water. We may price a gallon of water, or we may price a plant, or I may pay a standby charge for my externalities. But how do you calculate the externalities? It's not a simple carbon calculation or an energy calculation. It's a complex system fit calculation. If you're not thinking about the health of the whole watershed,
Yeah.
and the fit, and the and are we producing the full array of services that we get to through integrated water resources planning, you won't get the externality question calculation right. If you get it right, I love the idea of water funds, water surcharges into a fund to integrate and provide the basis for this kind of best fit planning.
Let's go to the questioner there in the back, middle row, I should say, the lady there, and I'll pick a third questioner in a moment. Please identify yourself. Sir.
Right, Sanjan with the Nature Conservancy, and it seemed like Vijay...
Is that a planted question there?
No planted. He doesn't know what I'm going to ask. But you sort of came close to hitting this point that I was trying to make, and I wanted the panel to comment on it. So it seems like what you said is, we live on a closed system, right? So water isn't being changed into something else, nor is it being lost to space. It's just going from one place to another. Basically, it's going from terrestrial systems, where the cycle is really fast, into the marine system, where it's a 10,000-year cycle. So doesn't that then argue that the only way we're going to deal with this water scarcity, and I don't like that word water scarcity, because it's not that, it's just how quickly it's moving through the system, is ultimately to slow down the movement of terrestrial water into marine systems? Because it takes so long for it to come back.
That's a great question. We will be sure to tackle that. The question. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Joni Clark-Bruce, and I'm an Aspenite. I'm the founder of Integrated Sustainable Solutions. We connect the dots between environmental and human health solutions. We work closely with native energy programs and lots of good things. And one of our, the way we measure those externalities is by the gross national product does not capture them. We use a gross social product developed by the economist Hazel Henderson, who's worked with us at the UN, and people around the globe like to look at her system. Because under the GNP, when you have the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and it costs, I think today is the 20th anniversary of what happened, and I'm waiting to hear the report on what those externalities cost. If it costs $2 billion to clean that up, that's a positive addition to the GMP. We're the liability side of that. Where if you look at a gross social product, the GSP, and I urge us all to take a look at that and adapt it as the measuring tool and not use a GMP because it leaves too much out of the equation. And right now we've just seen that with what's happened to our economy, our world, global warming. It's because we haven't measured all of those externalities. And Hazel's GSP system is just phenomenal at cost accounting on all of those levels. So I just urge us all to think about that. And my other P word is permaculture, because it's an integrated solution to looking at water, land use, populations, building, energy, all of those things. And I've worked closely with the Grameen Bank. So the fractal financing that's the whole integrated system put together. Thank you.
Let's go right in front. There's a lady here just in front of the microphone.
My name is Fran Ulmer, and I'm not a hydrologist, I'm a political scientist. And I'm thinking, as you are describing these problems and different ways of thinking about them, about what solution might there be. And I'd just like you to comment on the fact that, from a systems perspective, we've talked about environmental systems today. What about governance systems? Think about water and how they cross boundaries. Within this country, you're talking about cities and counties and water districts and states and regional organizations that have some potential for jurisdictional authority, but very limited. And there isn't much statutory authority in this country to to kind of deal with those issues? Certainly, I mean, there are limited things, EPA, et cetera, but very limited, and not from the standpoint of actually regulating use or allocating value or trying to include those externalities. So I just wonder if you'd kind of fast forward 10 years from now and think about the governance solutions that might exist to deal with some of these incredibly important things.
That's a terrific question, and it's the one that I'm going to end our panel on. But first, by addressing the other two questions, we'll save your question for last because it's a good theme to finish on. There was more of a comment, really, from the back about gross social product. I think, and perhaps fans of natural capital have argued this for some time. I don't think you'd find any disagreement on this panel. We've talked a lot about looking at externalities and properly rethink the framework beyond conventional GDP metrics. Did anyone have anything specific to add to that?
Just a qualifier. I'm worried about any gross whatever product. I'm worried more about, I'm interested more in trying to capture that pattern. So how are we doing simultaneously at providing access to clean drinking water, the needs for energy, for food, and whatever on that side, ecosystem services, social, cultural-based, indigenous social services. We have this whole array of apples and oranges, and I wouldn't try to lump it into any single product without being pretty careful about it.
Let me echo that point, something that Michael and I were discussing earlier. There is a slight risk of having a laundry list of all good things and saying, yes, we want this and that too, and the other thing. In real life, we have to make trade-offs, of course, and there are trade-offs. And this is something, having followed the global movement for sustainable development for many, many years and writing about this for The Economist, it became very clear to me that when we're talking about people versus planets, we need to have a concern for both. And that's really what sustainable development, the great mantra of this century, tries to put together. The idea that we must acknowledge both people and planets, but sometimes that does involve trade-offs. You can't have all things all times for all people, and the integrated resource planning of the sort that you advocate forces some of these trade-offs into the open so that you can make them honestly with proper pricing, understanding the externalities. I think that's what we are moving towards, new kinds of framework where you may not get everything you want, but at least it's clear what the trade-offs are. A quick point on that.
Well, I actually want to make a quick point about the governance.
Hold up for a minute, because we did have a challenge from the Canute of the audience. Rather than holding back the tides, he wants us to hold back the rivers from reaching the oceans. Would someone comment on the first question about what is the plausibility of keeping it?
It'll address Shanja's comment as well.
Please.
I think that the governance is really difficult. I've worked in the federal government for 20-plus years. I think nothing has been mentioned yet about how the web is changing the world and will continue to change it. 5,000 days ago, we had no web or commercial internet. 5,000 days from now, everything will be globally connected into. In fact, we were talking before about the opportunities in science to have embedded wireless sensor technology to draw continuous information off in a dynamic way. And I can think of nothing better than the convergence, particularly with the president who now is saying, let's get back on track with science, of a new educational insight with a governance of scenario planning. Where are the next generation? What are they going to face in trying to deal with climate and poverty and security and biodiversity, which are all interlinked, so that you would have almost schools becoming the local kind of not forecaster, but doing scenarios, including which is if our city was more energy and water efficient, would it slow down the need for the water from the systems and the basins? Would they be more intact? What are some of the other ecological services that are derived? And begin a whole conversation that will be a continuous educational, so at the very least, you come out a more informed citizen and be able to ask, I think, better informed governance questions than we currently have.
Ken, what do you think about this question of governance? What is the way forward? And to take up the lady's question, 10 years out, what might be good ways to move forward?
Well, I'm going to address this other question because it's easier. And that, I would just think that if you try to slow down the flow of water to the oceans, that the environmental consequences of that would be drastically negative. And That it seems that our efforts should be aimed at impinging less on the environment and not bringing more of the environment under managed control.
Well,
It depends on your
Peter,
starting point, doesn't it? If you're in a degraded basin and water's going out way too fast, you want to slow it down by watershed restoration. If you're in a pristine basin, you don't want to slow it down by building dams. There's a natural rate that you want to understand. It's a rate that's going to be problematic because it'll change with climate. But we need to start with some kind of understanding about that pattern, including the temporal pattern of the flow of water through the basin, and then manage from there.
Well, Peter, this is part of what the USGS does, right, is to look for data measurement. What do you think about
Sure.
this?
And David hit the point exactly that it's a land use problem. There are certainly areas where we have changed the landscape in ways that have increased flow. Rooftops don't absorb water the way soil does. So there's issues there, and there are management strategies that could be used to address those.
Although, just a note on that, we see in India and other places a move back to traditional rainwater harvesting approaches, which can be done on urban rooftops as well.
Exactly.
And so maybe there's a fix there.
So other things that could be done in that regard, sure. And there are efforts that are underway that way. I can go into the governance question a little bit as well, because the USGS has over the past several years started to work more and more with river basin commissions. The Delaware River Basin Commission is an interesting example. It's a group of states. The Board of Governors for the commission is the governors of those states. And they are trying to collaborate in providing sound management of the Delaware River and its watershed. So it's possible that over time these kinds of institutions could start to assist the states in developing strategies that are watershed-based.
And we have some examples from the Mekong, the Indus even, where India and Pakistan cooperated despite a conflict going on. We have examples, rather than some of the alarming reports about water wars. If you at least look at facts on the ground, water has more often been a source of cooperation, out of necessity, obviously, dire necessity. And so perhaps there's some hope, at least, that going forward, we'll see regional governance structures where people can learn to share this common resource.
I'm not sure the Mekong would fit in there, since there are water wars between the Chinese damming the headwaters, and all along there they're financing dams that are already undermining indigenous and traditional people's fishing lives. So that's more ambiguous, I think, at this point.
What any final thought, just as we wind up our panel on the governance question?
The governance question is the central question. I think this is the most important part of the problem. If we do our homework on all the rest of these things, we can figure out right solutions. But getting people to agree on them is tough. If you say, and if you set a target, you say 2020, what's governance going to look like? I am a pragmatic on this. Bit cynical and definitely pragmatic.
We hadn't noticed at all.
It's not, unfortunately, going to look very different from the way it looks right now. And so the question is, what can we do, as messy as it is, by way of muddling through to try to cobble together the essential information, to try to persuade key players to participate in the financial side of it, in funding integrated planning, to try to get, I think maybe key players is the right starting point. If enough key players see that they are at risk in coming up with a best fit in that basin and bring those people together, they may come up with some kind of, perhaps inelegant, but some kind of solution. I don't hope to see Delaware River Basin commissions that are really effective in a lot of places. I do hope to see an upgrade with the Mekong Commission. I do hope to see an upgrade between China cooperating with the Mekong. So this is tough. It is the toughest part of it. I think we have to be pragmatic. We have to work with what we've got. We have to be open in, the Nature Conservancy has a real single-minded mission. But we are starting to get it, that we only get there by working with this whole set of interests. And nothing better than water and river systems and basins gives it that context. We now know what we have to do. It doesn't make it any easier. But we have to work with everybody in the basin if we're going to get the kind of results that we need in the way of biodiversity.
Okay, well, on that pragmatic but hopeful note, I think we'll draw it to a close. I think you'll all agree that our very thoughtful panel has given us at least some reason to think that the ancient mariner will be proven wrong, and that, in fact, there shall be some few drops of water to drink. Thank you. And please thank my panel.